Okay, we're going to begin. Welcome, everyone, to CCTA's Expenditure Plan Advisory Committee meeting. Hopefully you got copies of the materials when you came in. There's plenty of those available, and you had a chance to sign it as well. My name's Ben Stromwasser. I'm assisting the CCTA in this process for the expenditure plan, and I'll be moderating us through this process today. I wanted to bring to your attention again that members of the public will have an opportunity to speak on multiple occasions here, the first of which is for public comment on issues that are not listed on the agenda. So if you have agenda items that are not listed here, that's what you would turn in a card for at this point. Just to go over the agenda, of which you've gotten a copy, it should be at the top of your packet. The public comment will go first if there is any public comment on issues not on the agenda. We will approve or adjust the minutes as appropriate. We'll get to that in a moment. We'll bring your attention to the calendar and the action item log. And then subsequently, we'll have a presentation and review of the draft TEP, a copy of which, dated April 8th, was distributed to the group, and what we'll be looking for input. Also included will be, in your packet is a copy of the red line strikeout version of that, so you can see where changes have been made to reflect input that we've gotten to date. There's also a couple of letters that will be highlighted in our presentation, and then for agenda item 2.0, there'll be a short presentation and then an opportunity for the public to provide any comments, and then for the EPAC's opportunity to discuss and make recommendations relative to the current TEP version. So that, at the end, we'll talk a little bit about the path forward, myself and Ross, and then we will adjourn by noon. Hopefully that is our target. I'd like to get you there. So there was an item that came in this morning. I just wanted to make sure that you have the Gray, Bowen, Scott memo, and also the prioritization lists. Those copies were distributed this morning. They were not in your packet, but we wanted to bring those to your attention. So let me begin by checking, is there any members of the public who want to speak on agenda items not on the current agenda? Hearing none, we will move on to approval of the minutes, copies of which, this is two sets of minutes from the February 25th meeting and the March 3rd meeting. They are attached. Are there any comments or motions in connection with the meeting summaries for those two meetings, or the meeting minutes? No comments? Is there someone who'd like to make a motion to approve?
So moved. Second.
Motion was moved and seconded. All those in agreement, say yes. Aye. All those opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, thank you very much. I did want to bring your attention to the EPAC calendar. It is also in here. You've seen it before. It walks through the path forward. We'll talk about that in a little while. Also, the action item list, which is complete to date, that is also in your packet. Did the EPAC members have any questions about that? Okay, excellent. And we're moving along. Item 1.0 is a review of the draft TEP, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ross Chittenden with CCTA to begin the presentation.
All right, thanks. Ben, I guess these are already on. All right, welcome everybody. Good morning. Thanks for coming out on a Friday to start out your weekend with us at CCTA. And I don't ask you to do that every weekend, but appreciate it this weekend. Wanted to spend a little time talking about where we've been since the last time we've been together before I jump into the review of the TEP, because I think it's pretty important that we try to put a context of where we are, and I'm going to try to do that, not saying it's good or bad, but it's where we are, and try to explain a little bit about how we got here. We last met on March 3rd, and a lot happened since that meeting. The agenda packet for that meeting, your agenda packet for that meeting, was really the first exposure of a draft TEP that was an attempt at a complete packet, or a complete package, a complete plan, and that's obviously turned into a lot of action, a lot of interest on that. Some of the things that came out of your meeting, included in one of the handouts that's on the table here, we asked you to do what I was calling some homework, and then we did some discussion at the meeting itself to try to capture your priorities. And we asked it in a couple of different ways. One was just your priority in terms of what's most important of the various elements that are in the plan, and then for the funding categories, which ones you thought needed more funding, and maybe it was a little unfair. We also asked you, okay, tell us, well, if you want more money here, where would you take it? And we didn't get a lot of response on that second question, and that's okay. Just kind of reviewing these priorities, and I think I want to do this. I think some of that's been built into the subsequent plans that were developed since our last meeting, and maybe more important, that some of it's reflected in the memo that Bill's going to talk about once I complete my review. The priorities themselves, I guess trying to look at maybe the top 5 or so. The 680 corridor seemed to be the most important, and as I've stated at prior meetings, 680 in the afternoon is now the 5th worst commute in the Bay Area. It's not only hurting our residents and the businesses in our county, it's affecting how people get to work. So it's a big problem, and it's you guys have, as well as many others, have communicated the need. We need to do something on 680. The second, I'd probably group it a little bit under a improved transit theme. So under that, we had almost at about 20 votes each, was non-rail transit enhancements, which is towards the middle, transportation for seniors and people with disabilities, and BART capacity, access, and parking improvements towards the left. So if you put those combined, that even, if you combine it, they actually would outweigh all the commute corridor investments, 680, Highway 480. So a very strong interest in improving transit and paratransit. And then third is probably the major streets and complete streets project grants towards the left there. So in the funding categories, I think those are the top 3, and I think we're going to be able to talk about today on how we've reacted to that, to those comments. Towards the left, or I'm sorry, towards the right side of the page, we get into some of the policy areas, and reflected on here is, I think, what we've heard pretty consistently throughout our whole dialogue, is that the growth management program, we show it as a funding category, but I think it's more of a policy, this community development investment grant program that really gets towards a strong desire to figure out how to incentivize infill in the county, and advanced mitigation are the 3 significant policy areas. And I guess I skipped over one on the program, or on the project side. The ped, bike, and trail facilities was the fourth in terms of what needs more funding, or the highest priorities. And that pretty much reflected in the next page where you said, okay, that's what's important to me, and are we doing enough from a funding perspective? So here we have, as the top priority was additional funding for seniors, for transportation for seniors and people with disabilities. I think we'll hear some good news about that. Non-rail transit enhancements, I think there's been an improvement on that to a funding level. Ped, bike, trail facilities, again, 680, and advanced mitigation programs. So all of those are addressed in some of the changes that have occurred to the plan since we've last gotten together, but I think it's good to review that before we move on. Subsequent to our meeting here on May 3rd, the initial draft expenditure plan and subsequent versions have been reviewed extensively over and over and over by our regional committees. And they've been very active. Some have been meeting as often as once a week. I characterize it as we write a sentence and we get to comment on, to review that sentence, and we rewrite the sentence. And, you know, we've got to get to the point where we're not doing that anymore. But I think the result of that, some comments I've heard is that the draft TEP is more reflective of the priorities out of the regional committees and certainly out of this group. And I'm not going to argue that. I think that's a very fair statement. And that's what makes today's meeting, I think, very important, is to try to provide that perspective, the perspective we're trying to get out of this group, which is, you know, not inside baseball folks. Our regional committees, we work with them all the time, and I have a lot of respect for that. But you know, we can expect a certain perspective, and I think we're seeing that in the plan. And as, you know, let's look at, is their perspective consistent with yours? The CCTA board has been meeting very frequently as well. We've had 5 meetings since the last time we've gotten together, March 9th, 16th, 29th, and then on April 6th, our board authorized the release of a draft expenditure plan. What we were working on prior to that was really a product of staff and consultants with input from others. This was, the way I characterize this April 6th version is that's the first version that really had our board's fingerprints on it, and I think that's how they're viewing it as well. Everything prior to that was a discussion, and it still is a discussion. So that April 6th version is the version that's in your packet, and that's what we'll be reviewing and talking about today. The April 6th meeting, the same meeting where they did authorized release of that draft, we got a couple of letters, and one came in on Friday, April 6th, or April 1st, the other on April 6th, from different groups of a smaller group of the EPAC here, that a number of folks that were working very diligently over a number of weeks to try to come to some common ground on what's the most important for them. And if anyone from either of those groups or any of those groups want to get up and make some comments, certainly do that. One of the letters was from the East Bay Leadership Council, Bay Area Council, and the BIA Bay Area. The other letter was from Save Mount Diablo, Greenbelt, and Bike East Bay. And there was a lot of commonality in what was included in those letters, and then a few things that were different. And we did include those letters as part of your packet, so it's an attachment to this item. As a result of getting these letters, and I think just trying to ensure that we're getting additional perspective from what we were getting from our regional committees, our board also asked Bill and his team to do an independent assessment of that draft TEP, and that's the letter that's also, well, we emailed it out yesterday, and you have a copy on your desk as well, and Bill's going to talk about that, and I'll leave it to him to set that up. But lot going on concurrently, a lot of things to track, and things happening quickly. So what we're trying to do here is to bring you up to the latest thinking of our board as of this past Wednesday, which was our most recent meeting. The last thing I want to talk about before I jump into the plan is just the steps or the process remaining to get to a ballot. There's a series of what I'd call just mechanical steps. Our board needs to approve a plan. The schedule to do that is May 18th. We have 3 meetings scheduled to get us there. Assuming that happens, the plan then needs to be approved by a majority of the city councils and the board of supervisors. And at least a personal opinion of mine, that's probably a big factor of why the plan that's in front of you is put our board. Of course, they're made up of members appointed from these committees, so that's part of it too. But also, I think a lot of it is, what's it going to take to get through city councils. And then if all that happens, CCTA would consider approving the final plan and an ordinance in July and asking the Board of Supervisors to place on the ballot. Now, that's all mechanical steps. To make it successful, there's a couple other things that need to happen. We need to continue with some public outreach with whatever plan we develop. And certainly we're hoping that based on the input and the actions to date and then some anything that comes out of this meeting and how that may affect our board going forward, that we can get as much support as possible out of this group. And then again, that's really the purpose of today's meeting. This is really the last chance that we have, at least scheduled chance that we have, to provide input into that process to affect what that final plan that our board would adopt on May 18th will look like. And we know that we need as much support as possible, and we know that to be successful, we need to find a way to avoid significant opposition. In May and June, we'll be conducting our next round of polling, and that would be asking the public to tell us, did we listen to what they had to say, and is the plan reflective of the priorities that would be successful for ballot in November. And then we're going to be developing a lot of communication material, because a lot of comment, and we were just chatting with Ron a few minutes ago. It's the way this thing is written. It's written in a manner that's easy to administer. It's not necessarily written in a manner that's easy to understand. So we need to. We're asking Bill and his team to put together a more public-friendly version of that. I wouldn't say we're copying what Alameda Measure BB did, but that's a good reference document that categorizes investments around themes, not around route numbers. What are you trying to do, and show how the different investments affect all that. And then that's going to also allow us to communicate the different interests and the different geographic areas on what the plan does for them. So going to walk through the plan here. I know we heard at our board meeting the other night, private conversations, that there still are a number of concerns related to some shortcomings that are in the plan. Certainly heard a lot of positive comments as well. So really going to ask you for both of those. Tell us what you like. Tell us what you like, but there's a way to do it a little different to make it better. And then if there are areas that you just really can't live with, or areas that are missing, that's probably those last two, either something that's just off the mark or some good idea that's missing. That's really what we want to take out of this meeting. What I expect will happen with that, we're going to be asking Bill and his team to capture that and probably produce a memo similar to the one that was taken into our board last week, is to say, here's the final input that we received from EPAC. Again, areas of agreement, areas of disagreement, areas of like, but we could do it better. So really going to ask you to speak up and be specific about the things that you really want to see transitioning from the version of the plan that's in your packet to what you want to see on May 18th. It then goes out to the public and city council. So before I jump into the review of the plan, is there any comment or question about that process going forward and what we're asking you to do here today?
I do. Is the public polling intended to affect the TEP and changes be made? Because it sounds like it's already going to be vetted by the city council and city councils and.
Yeah, that's a good comment. So once the requirement is that a majority of the cities and the Board of Supervisors all adopt the same plan. So we can't be editing it through the process. So the version that we come up with on May 18th is largely the final version. So that it would really be testing, did we hit the mark and is there real support, not so much to affect what the plan would look like.
Clarity around the presentation? Okay, we'll move on. Again, I'll just remind if there are members of the public and they do want to speak on this item, please fill out a speaker card.
All right, so jumping into, if you open your packet, the draft starts on page 1.1. It's about a third of the way through if you have a paper packet. I'm going to start with the outline, and again, the outline is how the plan's organized now, so we can expect that the reformat will be a little bit different than that. But for purposes of today, this is how the plan's organized. Next page is a preface, and
We make sure that people are there. It's 1-2 is the outline, right?
Yes.
Okay. Just want to make sure people are
Okay.
on track.
Yeah, so I'm going to be turning pages pretty quickly, so if you want to follow along, I'll try to reference the page I'm on. One of the Bill's suggestions is we rewrite the preface into more of a vision document. I'll let him talk about that when it gets to his turn. Page 1.4 is the current draft TEP allocation plan. I think many of you, if not all of you, have heard one of the consensus points coming out of our meeting on Wednesday was that we've kind of hit a minimum mark on many of the items, but we really didn't hit the sweet spot or an adequate level of funding to achieve what we want to achieve. So the direction was to come back with a proposed 30-year plan that would add about $500 million to that, and that's again addressed in Bill's memo, and we'll discuss that more. So I don't really want to spend a whole lot of time on this chart as it will be replaced. Page 1.5 starts the description of our funding categories. I want to go through this. I'll try to be brief. One is local streets maintenance improvements, also known as return to source.
Ross, I'm sorry for interrupting. You said you're going to be brief in these categories, and then we'll have a chance to address them later with Bill? Is that right?
I think that would be the way we'd want to do it.
Okay,
Is
just wanted
because
to
what I want to do is kind of give you an overview, and then Bill will go over the direction we got the other day to improve what you saw in the packet. So if you don't mind, if everybody's okay with it, I'd like to walk through the entire plan and then get comments. So local streets and maintenance improvements were, this has been an area of a lot of discussion. 23% we think satisfies the cities. We think it's a reasonable investment based on the fact that state and Fed dollars are very short to do this basic maintenance. We do know that there could continue to be a potential issue regarding housing incentives. A lot of discussions about how to use these funds as an incentive. So far, it hasn't got the traction that maybe some would like. So if we want to discuss that, we can discuss it more. Major streets, complete streets. this is one of the categories where we recognize there's not enough funding, so we'll see that in Bill's table. There is a corollary to this one. I'll talk about it a little bit later when we get into policies. This section generated a lot of discussion about if we're investing in our streets, we need to make sure that we're accommodating all users. So there is a complete street policy that's later in the document. We'll discuss that when we get there. And then related to the complete streets on page 1.6, get to the end of that description, we are dedicating 20% of the funding as an early action plan to do 4 complete street demonstration projects, 1 in each part of the county. So a lot of good work, I think, getting to that point. BART, this has been a significant discussion. I think all of us know that BART desires to expand their fleet. We agree with that. A lot of investment will occur with BART if their measure is successful. However, it will not result in any additional capacity unless BART expands their fleet. So there's a regional approach to funding this $1.6 billion. Our share of that is $300 million. This is written to be contingent on that regional approach being developed, and if the intent here is if that regional approach isn't developed, which means there would not necessarily be additional capacity on BART, that these funds would be used for alternate transit options that serve the same corridor. So the objective here really is to move more people on the BART corridors. East Country Costa Transit Extension, that's taking BART or other high-quality transit out to Brentwood, building off the extension out there that's currently under construction. And again, for that to work, we do need the additional capacity that's described in item 3. 5 and 6 are investments on the 80 corridor. 5 will be guided by a high-capacity transit study that's underway in that part of the county. 6 is improving some local access and some bottlenecks on I-80. It's affecting freight. It's affecting a lot of commute. Concerned about the level of funding, and again, Bill will address this one. 7 and 8 I'll cover as a group. They're really similar intent, just different parts of the county. 7 is focused on the 680 and 24 corridor. 8 is focused on the 4 and 242 corridor. And I know, certainly this is an area where we're hearing that the intent of what's in these categories doesn't pop off the page. We're all familiar with these routes. We're pretty much done building on these routes. So the funding here is intended to manage the traffic on these corridors, add transit along the corridors, sometimes using shoulders, sometimes through some other tactics, and looking at ways to increase vehicle capacity. So the biggest thing that cars are carrying around on our roads is air. So if we can replace that air with more bodies, we can address a lot of our congestion issues, and that's really what we need to do. 9 and 10 are 2 real construction projects. 9 and both of these are geared towards operational bottlenecks and safety issues. 9 is the 684 interchange. We have an interchange there. It just does not operate well, and we've had long-standing plans to address that through reconstructing that interchange. East County Corridor, Vasco Road and Byron, this is an area that's undergone very significant changes since we've been together last, and I know a lot of the folks in this room have helped work on a compromise here. Certainly on areas to address, we've heard over and over at our board meeting of residents of Byron that we need to get the cars and trucks off Camino Diablo, which rolls right through Byron. We need to improve a goods movement route if we expect to stimulate jobs on the northern waterfront and other parts of the county. And we need to address some of the safety concerns. Complementary to that, a lot of concerns about the cost of a new alignment, a lot of concerns about the environmental impacts of a new alignment. So the compromise here is let's put out a a modest amount of funding here and focus it on really two things or three things. One is construct a new connector between Byron Highway and Vasco Road that provides some of the goods movement connectivity and gets vehicles out of downtown Byron. So I think that's something that's recognized to be a very important goal of this. The rest of the funding is really geared towards non-capacity improvements to Byron Highway and Vasco Road. And a lot of that would be through some limited construction out there, adding shoulders, probably the whole length of Byron Highway, maybe some truck passing lanes, things like that, and then other uses of technology. So really, you can see in here that the intent is that the funding is used to improve existing routes and the new Byron Highway Vasco Road connector, not to build the new 239 routes that a lot of us have seen. That's a $1 billion project, and we just don't have funding for that, and we don't have the time to build that either. So this is getting something done a lot earlier. So hopefully folks see that as a good compromise. Bus transit and other non-rail transit enhancements, the funding that we see here is an increase of almost 2% from the May 3rd version. The focus here is both initially on improving existing service and then looking at ways to be flexible as service models may change over time. So again, that's trying to do something immediately and then recognize that we don't necessarily know what the future holds, and we don't want to lock ourselves into today's model if a new model comes along. 12, transportation for seniors and people with disabilities. This funding level here, the 3.3, is an improvement over what you saw on May 3rd, and I think in Bill's memo, we're even going to see more. So we're moving in the right direction on this category. The wording has been developed with a lot of input from a lot of folks in this group, not necessarily in the room here today, but we think we've got it structured so that there's consensus on developing a plan going forward using a mobility management model. People seem to be generally happy with that category. Safe transportation for children had a modest increase. Areas of the county, including Central County, are looking at ways to develop a program, so I think this will be an appreciated category. No changes to 14. 15, ped bike trail facilities. The way this is written is very close to Measure J. Bill's memo will talk about some proposed additional funding in this category, and sure there may be continued discussion about even more funding, so we can have that discussion. 16 is a new program, Community Development Transportation Program. I'm not really going to talk much about that. I think it's better covered under Bill's memo. 17 is largely what we discussed in the past, a little bit of reduced funding here. The dollars are mainly for pilots and demos. So that's the intent here, is that this is a little bucket of money to do pilots and demonstration projects, and then for the things we like, they would the additional projects that may come out of those demos would be funded out of other categories. A lot of people look at this and go, wow, you guys are all about technology and you're only investing 2.3% of your plan in technology. And that's one of the things we need to do as we redraft or reformat the plan, is we think technology is included throughout the plan and we need to better communicate that. 18, 20, those are some administrative categories. 19 is a little extra money that the regions want to set aside for unknown. We've initially kind of resisted that, but we've pretty much realized there are going to be issues that you can't predict today, and a modest amount of funding for that is probably okay. Moving into the growth management program and other policies, this starts on page 13, 1-13. The growth management program is mainly a continuation of Measure J, except for the urban limit line provisions, and I'll talk about that. And again, this is something that Bill will talk about in his memo, some modest changes to that, and certainly we'd like to hear from the group today is, what are the things that we could build into an additional growth management program that we think we could realistically get through our board and through some of the cities. Page 18 is a new attachment A, an urban limit line definition and compliance requirements. The main changes here, it's been rewritten to acknowledge all the jurisdictions have an urban limit line. In Measure J, that wasn't the case, so the language talked about how to put an urban limit line in place. What this is really doing is acknowledging the county has an urban limit line. A number of jurisdictions have adopted the county's urban limit line. A few cities have adopted their own. And it's really to put some more consistency into the process for what are referred to as minor amendments. Those are amendments to the urban limit line of 30 acres or less. The county has adopted some findings or conditions that need to be met for those minor adjustments, and this is saying that that should apply countywide to any jurisdiction. The other thing it does in here is limits or caps the number of amendments that may occur in a given period. A city can only approve one per 5-year period, the county no more than 3. 121 is a complete streets policy, and I want to really thank Dave and his team and acknowledge them for the effort they put into this. I think it's an innovative policy. It builds largely on existing laws and regulations, but I think it goes over and above that by adding some additional public participation opportunities, and then again, not in the policy itself, but back in the complete streets or the major streets category, we are requiring and funding a demonstration program, so that should be exciting. Advanced mitigation program, this is a policy statement based on where we are in the process of trying to establish a Bay Area-wide and even an East Bay pilot for an advanced mitigation program. We don't, at least in my opinion, we don't have all the background material needed to set up that program. So these conditions that are listed here, 1 through 4, are really the pieces of an overall framework that need to be in place, or that would allow CCTA to participate in advanced mitigation. So the intent of what's written here is that we're committed to an advanced mitigation program once these pieces get put in place. So regional conservation framework, so that's really the overall plan for investing in mitigation in the county, and that could be from transportation or any other purpose. So that developing that goes far beyond the transportation plan, and it really allows for some strategic and thoughtful mitigation countywide. The other items are more related to the plan itself, project impact assessments, what are the impacts that we can expect, and what are the estimated costs. And then we need to figure out who's going to lead this effort. It's really not a role that fits into CCTA that well. So the Nature Conservancy and their consultant ICF are going to initially lead the effort, working with MTC, and through the process we'll figure out what's the best entity, or maybe there's multiple entities that ultimately administer this. And there's a stakeholder group that's being assembled, and a number of you are being contacted to be on that, so appreciate your participation. Page 24 starts the governing structure section. Mostly this is carryover from Measure J. The one change I'd like to point out is here on this page 24, it's the Public Oversight Committee, something that we've heard from a number of you needs to be strengthened, the oversight and the transparency of our business. So the bullets here list the different tasks that we would ask this committee to do, and I should say it's a kind of a revision of our existing Citizens Oversight Committee by giving them more responsibility and changing the membership. So the responsibilities here on page 24 with these tasks, and then the membership is on the first paragraph on page 25, 15 members. 4, 1 each appointed by our regional committees, another 4 appointed by the Board of Supervisors, and 7 from different interest groups, including League of Women Voters, Taxpayers Association, East Bay Leadership Council, Building and Construction Trades, Paratransit Coordinating Council, Bike East Bay, and Save Mount Diablo. So if anyone has comments on that, I'd certainly welcome that. And the implementing guidelines, I guess the only 2 things I would highlight, I think there's only 2, is page 28, item 7 is fiscal audits. This is increasing the fiscal audits that we currently do. We do auditing now, so this is increasing the requirements for audits. And then number 8 is performance audits. We're suggesting that all of our programs undergo a performance audit that would be overseen by the Oversight Committee. So we've listed the categories in here that we'd like to see reviewed. This review period would be about every 4 or 5 years. Each of the programs would get an audit with the intent of an assessment. Is it working? And if it's not working or if it can be improved, what are the things that our board should do in terms of implementing guidelines? Let's see, with that, I think I'll wrap up my piece of it. I know that was a quick overview. We did an overview in the past, so hopefully we're starting to get familiar in how this all fits together, and each time we walk through it, it makes a little more sense.
Okay, thanks very much, Ross. I think we're going to go ahead and move on, and Bill has promised me that he's going to do this in 10 minutes. He might speed read. And this is in regard to what's become known as Bill's memo, but it is a reflection of what's been requested of the EPAC to make recommendations based on all the input, and he'll talk about that we've received to date. And these are areas where we definitely want to see if we can get input and feedback from the EPAC group.
Thank you, Ben. A couple things I'd point out. First of all, it's a memo with it says GBS stationery. It's on the top of the page. And I would also call your attention to a handout that it's 2 tables. They're stapled together. One's just black and white, and the other one's got some highlighted lines on it. That's what I'm going to talk about. Let me start by saying that we presented this to the CCTA board on Wednesday night, and the end of the discussion, long discussion, but the end of the discussion, they directed staff and our team to work together and implement all of these in the next draft. So the next draft that'll come out is going to reflect this. Ross said that, but I want to make it real clear. These are changes, at least are going to come out in the next draft. And one thing I would, just to start with, is that if you like the direction we're moving or disagree with that, this is the time that we really need that input, because I expect that there are some of these that the board members articulated individually, they don't necessarily support. So I think if EPAC as a group feels strong about it, I'd like to be able to articulate back to the board the reaction we're getting today. And then and if we miss something, I'd like to also know that, because as Ross indicated, I think what the reality is that we will provide the board with an updated draft. We were also probably going to provide them with an updated version of this memo that says, well, there's a few other things that have come up, and this is what we'd do. This memo was put together after a lot of thought and with my entire team interfacing with CCTA staff and reflecting on, for the most part, our perspective was the public input that we've gotten over the last year, from polling, focus groups, an extensive public outreach, telephone town halls. One key element of our effort here was trying to reflect on the discussions we've had here at EPAC, and in particular a couple letters that the board had received towards the just before, not this last meeting, but the meeting before that. So we're trying to reflect and provide answers. And then thirdly, we have to respond and reflect on what we've heard from the board itself and some of the regional committees as we put this together. Some of the themes that we were trying to accomplish is to better balance some of these programs on a countywide basis, because if we did have some comments, and I can point out in both in like the senior disabled category and in the bike ped category, there were a couple of the sub-regions that kind of put relatively small amounts of money in it. I like to refer to it as they had single-digit numbers in the expenditure plan that just didn't stand out as a strong commitment to those programs. So in other words, better balance. We also tried to reflect and provide some good public policy suggestions that we think help support the plan. We wanted to look at what the public was saying. The public in the polling and in the telephone town halls and in public meetings overwhelmingly was talking about pothole repair, major streets. They called it traffic smoothing. That reflects so. Then bus and transit were important, and BART was important. Those stood out. So we wanted to make sure that all of those categories stood out in the plan as priorities. I would say with that, I'll go through this relatively quickly, but and I'll maybe keep the categories together. In terms of corridors and projects, most significantly, we heard a lot of input from the public and some key stakeholders that the 680 corridor, that's as close as we have to a marquee project in this county. Just consistently on just about every poll, every focus group, we heard that. So we're recommending a significant increase to $250 million in that category. And that compares to, I think it was 130 in the prior measure. So it's virtually a doubling of the commitment in that program. The other corridor that got a lot of attention in terms of the public was the whole Interstate 80 corridor, high-capacity transit in that corridor. And we're shifting to a 30-year measure, which I neglected to say. That's the overarching recommendation, and the board was pretty clear in support of that idea, basically increasing the size of the pie a little bit. The Interstate 80 corridor, we were able to put significant more money on that. And we also commented on West County's decision to split into a high-capacity transit corridor and then a set of interchange improvements. We think it's important that the message to the public be that we're putting a significant, over $100 million investment into that corridor. So that's the recommendation, that those two items be combined. We acknowledge that it's an important project in West County, and we're going to make sure that the TEP provides eligibility for those interchange improvements, but we want it to be in the context of the overall corridor study that is undergoing. Anybody who's involved in West County has been watching. That's a very extensive high-capacity transit corridor study. And then the other important major corridor is the Highway 242, Highway 4 corridor. And this change allows us to recommend some additional dollars into those three major corridors. And then the rest of the corridor projects, in particular the East County corridor that Ross talked about, we didn't overtly say it in here, but we're recommending changes to it. So if we didn't make a comment on it, we're okay with the draft as it is. In terms of the programs, the two programs that we heard the most in terms of public testimony at CCTA and through the public processes, both senior and people with disabilities and the PED bike trail facilities. Our memo recommends that we increase to 4% all on both of those categories. I would point out on the PED bike category, that combined with the Major Streets Complete Streets program dedicates at least close to over 5% of the total revenue to that program. That was our response, and as Ross indicated, that we expect maybe some additional encouragement on the part of the various advocacy groups, maybe this committee, in terms of that category. One of the other things that we tried to do, and I mentioned this earlier, was better balance the allocations countywide. The draft that's on the street today reflects the asks from the various regional committees as opposed to a pro rata share of the dollars being allocated countywide. So if you compare, and you can look on the second sheet with the colors on it and see that we've tried to do a better balance of making sure that the various parts of the county all treated the senior disabled and the ped bike communities relatively equally. And the ones that stood out, and I mentioned this already, both the southwest part of the county in terms of senior disabled and the east county in terms of ped bikes, the allocation seemed low, so we were recommending increases. Probably one of the more significant changes that we recommended is with respect to, and I called it the wrong thing in my memo, but it's the Community Development Transportation Program. It evolved into the current TEP as basically a new and improved Transportation for Livable Communities program. The Measure J that was passed in 2004 had a very significant Transportation for Livable Community program that was intended to basically facilitate and help local communities deal with housing in their communities and provide a resource for them. We had a lot of testimony over the last year and a half that suggests that program still needed some work or wasn't really effective. We also had a lot of input in terms of this Community Development Transportation Program that this should be maybe focused on the job development in the county, the northern waterfront, and some of those areas like that. So what our recommendation is that the board basically reduce this to 3% in this measure, but then look back at the Measure J TLC program, and within the first year of the measure, if this passes, is look at effectively reconstituting or rethinking the program to make it into somewhat of a jobs housing program. I think Measure J is the housing element. It's about 6% of that measure, and this would be 3% of this measure. Focus, in my vision, is more on the job side. It needs some work. we're recommending that CCTA work with the stakeholders and work with the public agencies on this. This is a topic that could probably include some additional language, some additional legislative direction, if you will, in this measure in terms of the principles. And it would be interesting today to hear from you on the idea of the things that we would like to set up, if nothing else, as goals and objectives on that program. Number 7 on my memo talks about that under the policies. This whole CDI, again, it's labeled slightly different, but it's the Community Development Transportation Program. And one of the concepts that I had, I became familiar with the State Strategic Growth Council, for example, on affordable housing and sustainable community grants that the state makes under the cap and trade funds to local jurisdictions for affordable housing. And one element of that program requires a local match, and it just seems logical that this authority ought to prioritize and make available money to local agencies that are pursuing those grant programs, because that really is what we were trying to do, is incentivize infill, and as a way to do that, helping the local jurisdictions with match money. The rest of this, we had one of the more controversial recommendations from the stakeholder communities, and in an intellectual way, it's a good one, but the idea of incentivizing or tagging a portion of the local street and road maintenance funds or the return to source instead of allocating it based on population and road miles, we do that, take a portion of it and allocate it based on housing. In other words, the development of housing. Great idea. I like the concept intellectually. One of the problems with that, and our team in particular doesn't like it because it talks about housing, and when we poll the public and we talk about the public, this is a very controversial area. If a lot of you have been involved in advocating housing and infill development, know what the local communities, it gets somewhat controversial, and we don't need the controversy that surrounds some of those infill projects to carry into a campaign or a support for this measure. So what we're recommending again is that we look back on that, a kind of a combined community transportation investment program combined with the TLC program. And I would point out that puts almost 6% of one measure and 3% of another measure, almost 10% of a half cent, into a pool that the authority can work on. So I think it's the right concept. What it does need is some fleshing out and some bones, if you will, in terms of the proposal. One of the most significant comments that we've heard from a lot of folks was including meaningful performance criteria in the measure that basically requires the authority as they begin to allocate dollars, and particularly in the selection of an alternative in a corridor. And I'll use 680 as an example. In that corridor, there's going to be a task of figuring out how to spend the $250 million if they buy our ultimate recommendations on the 680 corridor and turn that into a project. And we think it's good public policy to run the various alternatives that are being looked at through some performance criteria. The region already has, through the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, a process that they do that. In my mind, it's good public policy. The sunshine should be applied to that process as the authority and as the project sponsors go to develop and implement those projects. So it just, and the board seems to be okay with that concept. The controversial part is that how strong that criteria is, and does the board still have the ultimate ability to approve a project that the public says they want? And so that's the line we're trying to go through here, but providing that information to the public as the decision makers. A couple of the other issues that was urban limit line, and this is an area that is still an area of continued discussion. The authority had spent quite a bit of time reworking and rethinking the language surrounding urban limit line to provide more consistency between the various jurisdictions. One of the discoveries as we put this together, and Ross in particular, kind of realized that there's 20 jurisdictions between the county and the cities, and there was probably 16 different ways of looking at and interpreting the urban limit line policy. So there's an attempt in here in the measure, and it's in the current draft, to make that a more uniform approach. One issue that we're recommending that all that language be maintained. We do recommend removing this. There was a proposed cap of basically only one non-voter approved amendment every year for the local jurisdictions, and I think it was 2 or 3 for the county. The input we've gotten is that was a solution to a problem that people hadn't been articulating very well, or not. I won't say articulating at all. It was not the number, it was the request. So this area, I expect some additional input in terms of the urban limit line, but I think we're moving in the right direction. The issue of an ag protection ordinance has been a very interesting and basically strong point. I think we're recommending that any jurisdiction proposing a non-voter approved amendment to their urban limit line that would impact defined ag lands should have either an ag protection ordinance and/or mitigate the loss of designated ag lands. And this is the lands outside of the urban limit line. And then with respect to growth management, we're recommending a number of disclosure items. You can read it in here. It's number 12 in my memo, but basically it's a reflection of again, what we believe is good public policy, simply for the agencies as they go through their, what we call in CCTA lingo, a growth management checklist, to simply disclose whether they have these types of protections in place. And then the last, I think it's the last, or two more. With respect to the labor folks that are strong supporters and always have been strong supporters of the CCTA, is adding some language related to payment of prevailing wages on projects. It already is law, but basically kind of restating that's the policy of the authority. Apprenticeship programs where necessary and appropriate, and a helmets to hard hats program. And then lastly, and this is the vision document that Ross talked about a little bit. One of our tasks is to kind of rethink the format of this, and it became clear at the last authority meeting, and it's become clear to all of us, is that we have a format that we basically developed in 1988, and we updated a little bit in 2004, but it doesn't clearly articulate the significant investments we're making in technology, in transit, which is not only one line item, but it basically, if you add up all the various categories that might have transit and transit elements, it's over $1 billion. We need to rethink how we present this, and so our team is doing that right now, and Ross pointed out to a good example is the Alameda measure. It had a very easy to read, clear document. It had a lot of pictures in it. It had a lot of graphs and articulating the impact and the benefits of these areas. So with that, that's our staff recommendation, or our consultant team recommendation, if you will. And again, as I pointed out, the board basically said include all these in the draft. What Ross and I intend to do when we present this at the May 4th meeting is to go through the TAP and show where we've put this input. There was some feedback, and again, I'm very hopeful that your committee today will either support, comment on, or suggest changes to this kind of an approach. And the only thing I'd point out is on this sheet, I'm not going to go through the detail of it, but there's 2 columns in here that shows the difference between the 25-year and the 30-year in terms of the dollars, and another column that shows the difference in terms of percentages. So you can see how the $535 million, that new money, if you will, that came from going from 25 to 30 has been allocated to the various, or we're proposing to be allocated. And with that, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Bill. I hope we can dedicate the rest of the meeting to hearing from you. You've gotten a good overview of the trajectory of the TEP and the memo, which outlines some of the critical issues. Just want to check first before we take some comments, and I want to suggest a way in which we take some comments and feedback and dialogue. Anybody from the public who wants to speak on this particular agenda item? Hearing none. So what we thought the best benefit would be here would be to get into a discussion or dialogue and input and feedback on the items that Bill has mentioned, because these are the ones that have been coming to the surface since we've begun this dialogue. And we thought we could so we're not talking at all different areas. We could talk about the programs, and we can talk about the projects related recommendations, then we can talk about the program related recommendations, and then finally the policy ones. And presumably the first 2 categories can go relatively quick. What I thought we could do is go around the room, give everybody a couple minutes to talk about, or you can pass to, if you don't have any changes or any comments or any questions, but to speak to the items that Bill went through, items 1 through 3, where those changes have been made to reflect what's been changed to date or adjusted to date. And I know there was a comment up here, so maybe we can start over here, and then and if you can try to stay in the categories, maybe then we can.
Are we talking about comments on Bill's memo,
Yeah.
numbers 1 through 3?
Correct.
So that's all the corridors and projects? That's what you're taking comments on right now?
Exactly.
Okay. Well, I honestly, I don't have comments on that, except to say that I know it's not an easy task what CCTA staff and the consultants have been given to make this plan come together, balancing all of the stakeholders' various interests, as well as the board and the city councils, et cetera, et cetera. We've been through this several times. And I'd like to just go on the public record saying that this plan before us today is something that we could support, and that you guys are coming along nicely. I have other comments on other categories in the memo, primarily on the BART issue, and I'll save those for a later time if that's more appropriate.
Excellent. I appreciate it. Thank you. Please.
I don't have much to add other than to say I agree with the comments Andy just made, and the plan so far is something that United Contractors would be in support of. It's looking good. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
I'd like to pass for the moment.
Okay. Kristen?
I'll just join the comments made about I think the investments in the corridors are important, so items 1, 2, 3 would certainly be supportive of those changes.
Tom?
My organization is Genesis, and our involvement, we have tension about just supporting, more and more highways. We're here because of our support of investment in youth and transit. So I'm sort of ambivalent at this moment.
Okay. Is there anything specific with regard to your expectations along?
I think, I don't feel like I have enough information. I mean, that's the first thing. Like, I don't think I need to bring this to, like, our leadership. That's our model. But I know that in measures that we supported Measure BB in Alameda County, and I know this was the biggest tension for our people, was more and more encouraging people in single-use vehicles on highways and congestion, and it's just not sustainable. But knowing that people have to get from A to B. And so this was a real tension. The struggle was real with our people on what to do.
And it was encourage versus accommodate. You know what I'm saying? Is that the projects were
Correct.
You felt like they were encouraging.
Exactly. Encouraging, enabling, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Dave?
Dave Campbell, Bike East Bay, support the increased funding to the 680 corridor and the 80 corridor. On the third one, the 242-4 corridor, not an opinion in support or against that, just a question, because in the major streets category, you've added funding across the board, which is great, and we'll get to that, but you have language in that additional funding that says something about this 242-4 corridor. So at some point, if you could clarify, in the major streets category, the additional money going to Central County is being prioritized for this 242-4 corridor. So what's the interrelationship?
And we'll talk about that when we get to the major roads category, because the relationship is really that we freed up some dollars, we moved it into the major roads category, out of another program. But I'll talk about that in a second.
Okay, Sean?
Sean Dugan, East Bay Regional Park District. I'll hold my comments till the future items.
Mike Cunningham with the Bay Area Council. So this GBS memo proposal is, for us, a huge step forward. Like some other folks have said, this accommodates our interests and a lot of other interests. It's something that I think a lot of the stakeholders could get behind, and we could get behind it too. Specifically to the corridors were one of perhaps the most important issue for the Bay Area Council and for regional employers. And so this, the increases proposed in Bill's memo, the GBS memo, are really important. And I guess I just want to add on to the comment Bill made about, or maybe ask a clarifying question about the comment Bill made about Interstate 80. I think it's first an increase in the allocation considered for the high-volume transit corridor is really important. And then the idea of combining that 55 million with the 60 that's anticipated for the interchange, I think is really important, certainly for optics, but particularly important if it's, and I hope this is the case, recognizing that the authority might be able to find money for that interchange from some other source and then be able to allocate more of maybe the entire $115 million to the high-volume transit corridor, which folks should know, it's currently under study by WICTAC, a variety of options on the table. The least expensive one is $250 million just for an express bus system. So having up to $115 million available for that would be really important.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think you're, on the issue of the interchange, you're right. I think it was one of the factors we had in there was the CCTA's incredible ability to leverage dollars. And, when we put a specific dollar amount in there, in a measure like this, it's harder than to go to your other funding partners and say, we need dollars. It makes it eligible. They could still allocate that much money, but I think it's, the thought is let's let CCTA do their magic in trying to leverage. That being said, it's a difficult environment to do that in these days because there's not a whole lot of state and federal money, but that hopefully is going to change over the next few years, the optimist part of us.
I was going to say.
Next. Lance?
Pardon me. John Muir Land Trust, Line Shukul. Yeah, we would support the first three, but I would hold placeholder on comment on the draft funding.
Rich Seithel, Northern Waterfront. We understand that the improvements in these corridors are vital to the Northern Waterfront as well, so we support.
Thank you. Bob?
Bob Lilly from the Building and Construction Trades Council. I appreciate that you've made a terrific effort to be all things to all people. And I must admit, I wasn't as optimistic as I am now. It looks like there have been a lot of things represented. I do want to say that this has been an educational process for me, because when I came here thinking of transportation, I had one idea, and that idea has certainly been expanded. I certainly think that we can support, with some limitation and talking about the future discussions, we'd like to get a little bit more information about that. I was very happy to see the addition to the labor portion that you mentioned at the very end. That was a very gleeful moment for me. I think this is something that we can support. Thank you.
Thanks. Cheryl?
From the perspective of the broader Labor Council movement group, for a 30-year measure, I think we would like to see a little, yes, our, working people need better highways. However, for a marquee project, we want to see a lot more detail and commitment to the transit corridors as part of this. So I would say we are reserving support at this time.
So is that transit as opposed to infrastructure for automobiles?
Yeah, I think we believe that this measure should take us far along the way of helping people get out of being reliant on single occupancy vehicles for a number of reasons, whether they're economic for a household budget, or whether it's, needing to meet certain state requirements to reduce GHGs and VMTs. But, bottom line, it's still a pocketbook. It's a pocketbook issue, and it's a time on the highway issue.
Okay, thank you, Cheryl. Peter?
Peter Leiden from Transdev. I'd like to echo what Cheryl said about should be doing more for general, broad, long-term shift away from single occupancy automobiles. But I'd like to stress one thing that she mentioned. I'd like to give it a very heavy stress. There's not much talk in the plan, nor in Bill Gray's very positive changes done in the last few days, about greenhouse gases and vehicle miles traveled. But for my group, these are the overarching considerations. This is what it's all about. This is the larger historical page, and the realization that greenhouse gases, carbon in the atmosphere, does what it does, damages the climate, is relatively new, but it's also hugely important, and it's very easy to make an adaptation to it slowly, carry along a lot of conservative elements of the way we live, our reliance on cars, the whole system we built for automobiles, particularly in a county like Contra Costa. But the fact of the matter is, it's a new day. Climate change is upon us. The state of California realizes this, but we've got to realize it at all levels of the way we live, all levels of government, all levels of where we invest. And this plan simply doesn't do that. And so we think, we understand why it's missing a necessary historical change, basically rather radical change, but we think that's a big mistake, and a different level of planning is needed. Frankly, we think that that can't be done in the framework of a TEP. Should go back to the county-wide transportation plan, and that should be done, frankly, with a fresh start and bringing in people who have the new perspective and starting fresh and cutting much deeper. So we would not be in favor of going forward with this TEP. We think, frankly, it's unlikely to succeed, and if you can make a serious judgment that it's not going to succeed, then the county should drop it. It's an expense. It's going through a process that's not going anywhere.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Comment down here?
If we're just talking about corridors and projects right now, I'll pass.
Okay, and Ron?
I want to start by saying Happy Earth Day. And it's nice that we're getting a little moisture coming down to refresh us all and our Earth. So I have a number of comments to frame this. The first one I want to suggest is the 30-year question. We've kind of quickly skimmed over that and just seemingly accepted that that's a pathway we're on, and it has a lot of positives associated with it in the fact that it creates another $500 million that lets us to allocate it out and kind of satisfy any number of people who are sitting around the table, which I think is a positive thing from one perspective. The other point of view is 30 years, is a long time. And given the pace of change and things that are happening in the world today, we're locking ourselves in for quite a long period of time. And I don't think we've considered all of the implications of that in quickly making a decision to go to 30 years. And I think a couple of the other speakers have alluded to some of the issues around that. So I'm not going to go into that in greater depth. I think, though, that words matter. And so as we're looking at these 3 corridor projects specifically, I have had some conversations that give me a sense of what other words there are behind these words here. But we are talking about not necessarily building new roads. We're talking about building innovation and technology into our roadway systems and trying to create the ability to move more people in other than single occupancy vehicles. And I think that is the intent that's behind this. But if there's lack of clarity and understanding even here today, think about how this is going to play when we put it in the eyes of the voters. I think there's probably more agreement about what we're trying to accomplish on these items and the good that this level of funding can do on these projects, but we're not articulating it clear enough even for ourselves at this point to really understand that. And I did talk to Bill and Ross about some of those issues this morning here. We need to really be thoughtful about words matter. So if it is the roadway projects, the corridor projects that are for technology, for moving more people through more quickly in less numbers of vehicles with BRT and any number of other enhancements, I think that's a move in the right direction.
Great, thank you very much. Bill just had a quick comment, then we're going to go on to the next.
Yeah, and I wanted to echo what Ron just said. I think we acknowledged over this last couple of weeks that the way we've said this and the format doesn't clearly articulate the intent. And in response to the idea of in fact, our recommendations related to more money on 80, 680, and 242 corridors. And if you read the words in here, and I just want to echo a little bit of it, is, the only authorization for highway elements of these things are those required to implement express lanes or transit projects or advanced traffic management programs or other projects program that encourage connected vehicles and autonomous vehicles. It is not to expand the highways for single occupant vehicles, and it's explicitly said in there. That being said, we realize that we didn't say it very well and very clear, and we're gonna, when we reformat, we're gonna emphasize that. And so when you look at these corridors, the bulk of that money is either gonna go to a transit type fix or to a or the improvements to make transit work better in those corridors. It's not going to go to building a new lane and all that stuff like that. I mean, there's going to be some of that because that's what's necessary to make the buses work, because a bus won't go very fast in transit. The performance criteria that we're talking about here, and I emphasized, is the intent to help inform the public and inform the authority as it goes through this process. Ideally, that would have been done in the countywide transportation plan, and it would have been done before this process. We want to at least salvage some of that process by requiring this performance criteria as a part of the selection process. And then I think that's the bulk of the thing, but there's a significant investment in transit here that isn't clear by the way we articulate it. And I think when you see the next version of this, you'll see that how much ultimately could be available for moving people, not single occupant vehicles.
Okay, let's go ahead and start the other way. Ron, we'll start with you on the program items. The two main ones were the transportations for seniors and people with disabilities.
So let me just add, I just want to circle back
Sure.
and just talk for a moment about why we're all here, which is really for best interests of the citizens and the people who work in Contra Costa County. At the end of the day, we're trying to improve a situation that is a problem for all the people who live and work in Contra Costa, and that's transportation. Now, it's easy to transform a transportation measure into other things like growth management issues, environmental protection, income equality, et cetera, and so forth. But at the end of the day, this issue is about transportation. I think that we have hit on some of the most important issues in Contra Costa, which are the major corridors, transit, bike accessibility, and being able to encourage growth in the right places. Let me just talk for a moment about the alternative, and that is if we don't pass the message, this measure, we'll lose almost $1 billion going into local streets and roads that money is not going to come from some other source because of the way of the gas tax. And we won't have the money for improving BART, and we won't have the money for improving transit, and we won't have the money for trying to really do what I think is a transformative measure on Highway 680. I mean, we stand at the threshold of a transformational change on Highway 680, where you will see an increase, probably a doubling of the throughput on 680 via technology in mostly electrified vehicles. They are not going to be gas vehicles. They'll be mostly electric vehicles. And they will be multiple vehicles. We're going to do this in Bishop Branch with the newest autonomous vehicle we're putting out there later this year. And those vehicles will solve some of the last mile and first mile issues to get greater accessibility to transit, which helps workers who don't have access to vehicles get into transportation and be in the mainstream. At the end of the day, the greatest thing for us in Contra Costa for all people is to have people be able to have accessibility to jobs and to housing. And I think that we can transform this if we handle this in the right way. Now let me just talk for a moment on another issue, and that is that we are at historically low interest rates. If we delay, I'm reasonably sure that interest rates are going to be higher 3 years from now than they are today. And those are tens and twenties of millions of dollars that will come out of this measure. The fact is that the problem demands urgent action. And we can't stand by here and kind of cut around the edges. We need to go right to the heart of the problem and deal with our corridor issues, deal with our local maintenance issues, deal with our transit issues, and try and solve that problem. And I couldn't be more sympathetic to the issue of greenhouse gases. I mean, we all are concerned about what's going to happen to our children and grandchildren, and I'm very sympathetic, but I do believe that this is a way of solving that problem. So I would encourage you to adopt this. I think that there are some compromises. I think there's some encouragements, but I just want to interject the sense of urgency in taking action.
Thank you very much. Okay, if we could, Ron, can we just, and people can go ahead and pass if they don't have any changes that they want, but on the programs, again, they were the senior and people with disabilities and the additional funding for pedestrian, bicycle, and trail facilities, and then the CDTP that Bill talked about. Ron, any comments on that?
There are others here who can speak on those items, so I'll in deference to time. I want to talk about the third section. So.
Indeed. Thank you.
Let me interject a comment here. I know we're trying to focus on Bill's memo, but if there's other program categories that you want to mention, I think it's the time as well. I know we've only articulated a couple here, but if there's others that aren't in Bill's memo but are in the plan that you want to talk about, that's fair game as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm also waiting for the policy section.
Okay. Peter?
I'll pass at this point.
Thank you. Cheryl?
I will pass.
And Bob?
I have no comment on this section.
Rich?
Pass. Pass.
I guess I can pass on 4 through 6, reserving that. I'd like to say something about the housing incentive and CDI, which I guess will be under policy.
Okay. Sean?
Sean Dugan, East Bay Regional Parks. I think these proposals are a positive step forward, not only towards balancing the funding and policies throughout the subregions, but also balancing out this transportation expenditure plan between roads and potholes and maintenance, and this is simplistic comparison here, and investments in the future. I've been saying all along that if we're going to increase funding for road repairs and parking at BART, et cetera, we also have to think about the other side of the coin. And I think that this is a very positive step towards that. I applaud your efforts. And just for the record, this amount, from a funding amount perspective, is not enough to address the projects and overcrossings and gap closures that we've identified, but the Park District is willing to accept this amount here and support this increase to 4%.
Thank you very much. Dave?
Dave Campbell, Bike East Bay, in support of all 3 of these program improvements. I do want to make a few comments on the number 6, which involves the major streets, complete streets. I do want to see that this category explicitly be stated that it's a competitive program. And I know some key decision makers are thinking this program is going to fund the projects we designed 10 years ago and for 5 years have been waiting to get funded. And maybe we'll add a bike lane to it. And I want to make it clear that those projects can compete for this funding. And good luck to them. But it needs to be a competitive process that meets the goals of the program. And either this program needs its own set of goals or criteria, or the broader ones that you've come up with for projects over 25 million can help us decide which projects. But some of these projects will be less than 25 million, and we need to make sure that this is a competitive process and the best project can win that gets us to our goals. So my main concern there. The idea of the current TLC being a housing thing and this new CDI being a jobs thing sounds great. I think you have Bike East Bay's full support with that as we learn more details. I like where you're going with that. And then at some point I do want to talk about the 5-year extension, the 30-year. It relates to the bike ped funding and a lot of funding categories, and I'm happy to make my comment now or hold it.
You can go right ahead.
I think it's better, rather than extending this 5 years, is to top off the 25-year plan we've been discussing so that Contra Costa will see a full 1-cent transportation sales tax through the current J and this new one through the year 2042. And there's a couple reasons for that. One, is I think the additional roughly $500 million we get from this, it's real additional money. And I'll just say I'll use Bike Ped as an example. The additional 5 years you're adding, years 2043 through 2047, maybe. I'm sort of seeing the money from that, whatever percent Bike Ped would get in those additional 5 years without this extension. I still see it coming in. I don't think the voters are going to say in 2042 we need no more transportation sales tax dollars. End of the whole concept. I sort of feel like the voters are going to reauthorize something. And so in that sense, conceptually, I'm not sure we're getting a whole lot of new money for Bike Ped here. Whereas if you top off the program through year 2042, that is 100% new money. And they both have advantages for Bike Ped and to Bike East Bay, but one has way more advantages. And you can say the same thing about every other program you topped off. So conceptually, it's a much better approach, in my opinion. There's another reason I think it's a better approach, and Bill, maybe you or Eric Zell can address this, is with this 5-year extension concept, we're going to have to go back to the voters twice, roughly every 10 years, because we'll have these staggered programs. And who the heck wants to do that? Whereas if you top off the current, or the previous, I guess it was, program at 2042, the voters will have one decision to make as they approach the year 2042. Do you want to reauthorize this measure, and at what level? At a full cent, half cent, quarter cent, whatever the discussion is at that point. But they make one decision as they approach 2042. They extend it to wherever they want to, and then they make one more decision rather than making these staggered 2 sets of decisions going forward. That just seems like nonsense to me. But I'd like to hear your opinion on that.
Just real quickly, first of all, this is a proposal for a new half cent, 25 years, and there already is a staggered end. It does not align with the end of the existing Measure J program. So this is simply, our recommendation is simply adding 5 years to the end. Now, we've talked a lot about that as a consultant team. The heavy lift for the public is the idea of a second half cent. We've polled in Contra Costa and in other areas and seen there's not a lot of difference as long as there's a sunset on the end. But Dave, I understand your concept, but the way this process has gone so far and the asks from the various regions, without providing a bigger bucket, if you will, we didn't have any ability to provide, the balance countywide on programs like the Ped Bike program and put more money in East County without severely cutting something else that was important to the locals. And
no, it's a wash. You can top off the last 5 years before 2042, or you can extend a half cent an additional 5 years. It's a wash money-wise. And with my idea of topping off, you're going back to the voters once.
Well,
either way, with the other options, you're going back twice in 5 or 10 years, and that just seems like work that we don't need to do for ourselves.
I can interpret your question. First of all, we can get together. I can show you some of the numbers later. I don't want to spend all the time, but the reality is, I think a better answer to the question is it possible to align the ends of the 2 measures so that they end at the same time? And that is a question that is a legitimate question that could be put to the board and ask that, because it does affect a lot of different programs, and I'd have to check with our team, and when we do this second poll, we could check that question. But quite frankly, I think it just confuses the issue too much. We have gotten 2 years into this with the idea of a second measure, effectively a standalone measure. It's not that simple, but the message to the voters has to be, this is what you're getting for this measure. We will look at that, and you and I should talk later about this specific.
Let's do that. I'll just add for everyone else's benefit. My idea of topping off is exactly what we did in Alameda County. And to my recollection and the experience there, it was a non-issue. Yeah, it's a little more language to explain, but nobody came back and said, I'm confused, I'm voting no. Or nobody came back and said, wait a minute, you're deceiving me by, it's a half cent increase and then it becomes a full cent. It was a non-issue.
Thanks, Dave.
Mary from Genesis, and just express support for all 3, and just want to make sure that It's not clear to me how, what the outreach was to low-income communities, communities of color, in getting feedback, especially for programs that benefit seniors and people with disabilities, because many times those programs, it's the same people that give feedback. And so I guess in a way, I'm in support of something like this, and I could see our base being in support because it would balance, the money for the highways. But I think that there's like a nervousness that the money just gets like dumped into programs and then the people have no way of giving any feedback. It's just like an iron wall.
Thanks, Mary. Tom?
I'll just wait for the next section.
Okay.
I'll pass.
Nothing in there. Okay, so why don't we start at the end? We'll go back around.
What are we talking about now?
We're talking about policies.
So that includes?
7,
7,
8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14?
yes.
Or others that we didn't.
Or any others.
Take your time.
Sorry.
Take your time.
I'm not smart enough to talk about the growth management plan or urban limit lines, so I'll leave it up to those who are more read up in that category. I do want to at some point talk about the BART provision in the measures, so I'll still reserve my comments for that. Thank you.
No, yeah, I can't do the urban living line. I'll pass for now. Thank you.
So I think that the key thing here is we ought to be rewarding those cities that are accomplishing some of our objectives, which are to provide high-density housing near transit hubs and get workers closer to jobs. And to the extent that we're able to incorporate incentives to accomplish that, I'm fully supportive of that.
Okay. Tom?
Okay, I'm just going to be general in this. My associate Joel, who's done a lot more detail on this, is far more versed, but let me just say a couple things. In a general sense, the impression that we get going to these meetings is that the planning process is basically upside down. And if you have the analogy of a pyramid, what you did first was allocate and then create the policy statements. And I think that's, in the late date of this planning, it's coming across as disingenuous in the sense that a lot of what you're showing to us now is after the fact, where we were strong advocates that you should have used these policies as transformative and to use them as part of your planning process. We don't think you have actually used these criteria that are now in TEP as part of your planning process. I would just go back and directly quote what you have in the packet from my associate Joel. Our priorities, and this was on page C31, number 1 was an equitable, sustainable infill development. We had a strong opinion that this is the way that the state is going, and that the planning process begins at that level, not as item 11 on your memo. It should have been item 1. Same thing with what else Joel says. Number 2, avoidance of impact on agricultural. What you've done is basically put in recommendations and suggestions, not actual requirements. We think that as part of a planning process, that should have been one of your priorities. The third one, proactive investment in conservation and in smart planning. And then the fourth, the competitive options for transit. You've made an effort to put these in here, but as I can read them now, not one of them is really a requirement. They're all recommendations and what you might consider hope. So we'd still recommend that it's not too late to actually incorporate where the rest of the state and the Bay Area is going and to make these fundamental criteria for your planning and not just to throw them in at the end. I think that's a major issue we have. And then just as an aside, to me, there's a lot of talk of technology, and the word that everybody's using is innovative. And I would just say that technology can be innovative and at the same time not be transformative. And I think there's a real disconnect, even last night showing all these great things with riderless cars, and I'm not sure that the way we approach transformation is a fundamental change in the way people are going to be living their lives over the next 30 years. And to address it with the same old concept of efficient transportation without including the way we live, where we work, and how we move is a major fundamental difference we have in the way that you're approaching this. I think that it's wrong to say that it's the format that's going to change our opinions. It's not the format. It's the way that you approach the needs. And we're just fundamentally opposed to doing the same old status quo. We really do believe what Peter is saying. It is now that you need to address what will and is changing over the next 30 years, and not to address it by just using the same old ways we approach it. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. Mary?
I guess the only thing I have to say is just that I just question the inclusion of people who are affected by some of these issues in giving feedback and outreach. It's just, again, it's just not clear to me who were stakeholders, were communities of color, low-income people included.
Thank you. Dave?
Sorry, what are we addressing?
We're addressing the policies. And
Oh, all policies. Oh, okay.
So it's item 7.
Yeah, okay. Maybe just some general comments that are policy related. One, the performance evaluation that Martin gave at the board meeting, I think it was 2 board meetings ago, where he showed that, if the state and the region do some things, we're going to get closer to our goals for greenhouse gas reductions. And then he showed a slide that said this TEP can get us to our goal. And I never got clarification on how that was going to happen. I'm wondering if, and I missed the last board meeting, if that was clarified there, or where do I go look to learn more about how the TEP gets us from where we would go without the TEP to our goal? That would be helpful, and I think would be super helpful for a lot of stakeholders here.
Let me respond real quick. So there was an update to that on this past Wednesday.
Okay.
And it really is taking proactive steps to increase the penetration of the electric or fuel cell type vehicles, non-emission,
And
zero-emission vehicles.
I guess this does this. I think Alex made that comment on the 680 corridor, but I'll learn more. It sounds like you're on it. I just haven't gotten up to speed on that. We did want to, or we were going to see a plan at some point. I thought the board wanted to see a plan that they thought would get the most votes, whatever that plan would be, and at least have you guys give us a sense of what that plan is versus the version you're about to put together. And then in the performance evaluation, we did see 2 scenarios, kind of an active transportation and more of a freeway road orientation performance evaluation. I'm wondering what do those 2 plans look like? Up to now, we're always looking at one plan. It's probably a combination of things, and I'm wondering, is there a plan when you did that performance evaluation that was the sort of the walk, bike, transit plan, if you will, and another one that was different, that was more freeway road oriented? And could we see that? Would that be helpful for us to look at, to see which plan, what the plan looks like that gets us the most greenhouse gas reductions, I think is the one, and the other plan is what gets us the most votes? Would that be helpful for us to review and provide input on?
So let me respond real quick. So Martin's report had some background, so it was kind of a bookend of higher level investment towards transit and active transportation, and another higher level investment towards road infrastructure and that. And so we can provide the details that are behind each of those. And your last comment, I want to reflect on what I tried to say kicking off the meeting here. the direction that was to Bill wasn't necessarily what's the plan that gets the most votes. It's the plan that has the highest chance for success. And that's why I wanted to walk through the steps. Part of getting success is going to be to go through the city councils. I mean, that's just a fact. So it's really to navigate through a lot of different paths. And then ultimately, you know, the public will be the final judge, and that's what we hope to get with the polling, is to say, hey, the public's going to judge that this is a successful plan or a plan that they would support. So it really wasn't necessarily what gets the most votes, is what gets us through the process, all the hurdles we need to get to, and gets us at least 2/3.
Fair enough. I think that's what I meant.
Okay.
With that.
So that was the intent of the direction of the bill.
Okay. And then one other higher level comment that I think it would help if staff or other consultants could have a conversation at the board is there's some board members who say things that have a logical disconnect to me. And they I know that's a surprise, right?
I shouldn't laugh. Fired.
But it's important with some of the decisions we're making. So for example, and you picture your favorite board members as I say this, we'll hear board members say things like, we can't predict tomorrow's technology, transportation is changing quickly. And they say that to support things like innovative technology. And that makes a lot of sense. And then they'll say things like, people are always going to drive and we're always going to have to repave our streets. And that makes sense too, but to me that's a huge disconnect. And I have a sense of why they're saying that. They're saying one, to support things they like, and the other to support things they don't like. And that's fine too, but I think there needs to be some clarity to that. I don't think it's helpful to the public and to the campaign eventually for us to be saying transportation is changing rapidly and people are always going to drive. That's just a huge logical disconnect that when the board says that, I think the discussion has to continue. It can't stop there and say, oh, okay, then we have to increase funding for local streets and roads. We have to increase funding for technology. It's just a huge logical disconnect. And we keep hearing it. It's almost like, of course transportation is changing, but of course it's not. And I'm left wondering, how are these comments, if they keep happening, or how are they helpful to the discussion?
I think the thing that we all have to remember is that this is a 2/3 vote requirement, and the comments you get from a lot of the board members are reflective of a lot of reality out there. And the real challenge here is transformative in the context of the 2/3 vote requirement. And you know, when you talk about some of the things that are happening at the state level and some of the things that are happening at the regional level in terms of planning and stuff, none of it is bad. It's all good. But for example, MTC comes up with a policy and it doesn't have to go back to the vote. This has to go back at the end of the day for a vote. So that's why you see some of us trying to walk the line here of talk about highway corridors and transportation corridors, but at the same time, de-emphasize single occupant vehicles and de-emphasize, and then talk about performance criteria in the decision-making process, which my words put sunshine on the process so the public can see and talk about, and they can debate this issue of that. But if we just ignored what, I don't know what the number is, 60, 70, 80% of the public that gets in the car, drives down the road, is part of the congestion, and we just say, you guys are all wrong, you just all got to get in a bus, I don't think we pass this. I know we can't pass this measure. So that's what we're doing. I think there's a lot of transformative stuff in here. And what I want to challenge all of you to help us as we get into the details of it. You know, the outreach to the various communities, we've done a lot of that public outreach, and the mobility management concept that's embedded in here has been a lot of work and a lot of background. It is innovative for Contra Costa. So I think that we're there. It's a dicey thing to walk that line. And I want to acknowledge a lot of the comments about the countywide plan, and I think Ross and I would both agree that we could have done a better job, and Contra Costa needs to rethink it. But it's happening. Contra Costa is working to it. Was this performance analysis that was discussed at the board the other day is a positive step in the right direction, but quite honestly, you get a disconnect on the way people receive it and understand it. But our recommendation is we continue to use that kind of a process. That's embedded in here, but I want to get through the room because I think the comments are all good and they're all positive, so.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, I'd like to do that too, if we could just move on.
So I'll just go up in elevation here. I'm not going to provide a comment specifically on any one of these items, but I will say that this whole section here is what's going to make or break this plan. And I know there's a lot of work to do. I know there's been discussions with various groups within the EPAC and in subcommittees of the EPAC. And I encourage you to continue those conversations and really look at what it is you're asking for and maybe ask yourself, is this too much? And also look at if you're holding on to something that is not transformative and something that's a past belief that, and missing the fact that infill development and things that regarding growth, the way we grow, it does have an impact on transportation. It is all related. And it's easy to say, no, transportation's buses and trains and cars. But our cities were developed by how we could move, and then it shifted in the 20th century. And now the way we develop is shaping how we get around. And now people are literally faced with the only way to get somewhere because they're way out somewhere else because of sprawl or wherever, they have to drive. And that shift happened because of the automobile. It'd be nice to balance that back out. I don't think we can tell people they're wrong for driving because this is the choice we have because of how we've developed. So I think these policies here really, really need to, they're important. And I encourage the groups in here to please continue discussions and get somewhere. Thanks.
Thanks, Sean. Mike?
I think you've really done a commendable job trying to navigate the different and often conflicting points of view on these policies. Like Eric, I hope it's good enough. I don't know that we can really do much better than this, given that there are some deep areas of disagreement, but at the end, it's important to get a measure. The one area, I guess this kind of lands in policies, in which the Bay Area Council remains unsatisfied is the treatment of encouraging and supporting the production of housing in the right places, both because of the critical need for housing and the essentiality of it being in the right places. So we continue to think that the housing production formula for a portion of the fund is a good idea, a necessary step, a very workable one, and one that explained correctly the public could and would support, and one that belongs in a transportation measure. Explanation for all of that being that there are communities that are choosing to build more housing, more infill housing. There's investor money to do that. Those communities they're going to bear more transportation burdens, and so they need and deserve more money to provide the necessary improvements to support that increased level of housing, that increased level of density. I think we originally started talking about this as an incentive or arm twisting to get local governments to do what we want them to do. The fact is, they're going to do it or not do it based on, as they say every time, the market, when a developer shows up, and what their jurisdictions can tolerate. But when they do it, we need to help them. Anyways, we continue to support the housing production formula. I mean, unfortunately, the community development transportation program just won't do there. It's a whole different kind of thing. I'm somewhat encouraged by the fact that it's gotten smaller. So although in the end it's really just another grant program to local jurisdictions to do something that they want to do, and they'll tell a story about how it's connected to job creation or housing production, but it's really just going to be a project they want to do. So, at least it's not that big of a pot. Honestly, I'd rather relieve CCTA staff of the burden of having to run that program, and if there's going to be $86 million for more local grants, just put it into return to source, right? So I guess, that is my comment.
Thank you very much. moving along, and we are running a little bit late. I hope folks can stick around so we get through this and then kind of wrap up. Go ahead.
Linus Schukel, John Muir Land Trust, and I appreciate the idea that we're trying to anticipate a possible moment of opportunity and to pass an initiative. And I hear the appeal for an inflection strategy, and happy to participate in further discussion of detail, and especially with respect to advanced mitigation plan were this to move forward. But to that point as well, just jumping around a little bit here, the TEP anticipates establishment of an oversight committee. I just request that that be expanded to 8 organizations that include John Muir Land Trust by way of geographic equity and our service area being included in that discernment and oversight.
Okay. Thank you very much, Rich.
I appreciated very much earlier hearing the comments on number 7 on the community development about the jobs. That was music to my ears from Bill and from Ross, particularly mention of the northern waterfront. And I do agree about that it's not a tremendous amount of money here, but I think it's important to recognize with the housing that you do look at the jobs housing ratio. So it's a ratio. So you've got the housing, but it's important to have the jobs. And I think that we need to be looking at that more in just about everything that we do. I appreciate the comments. I'm not sure I read it in the statement, though, so I'd be very willing to work on it with some of the county staff and maybe put a little bit more of a job emphasis on it.
That'd be good.
Great. Bob?
Bob Lilly, Building and Construction Trades Council. I believe it was Mr. Cunningham who said that he thought this was the best we could do. I certainly agree with that. I also agree with Mr. Marin that it's time to get the party moving, and I have no other comments on this section.
Thank you.
A few comments on behalf of the Labor Council. If we're talking about jobs, we need to talk about job quality and a range of jobs and pathways for, people throughout the community, and look at diversity, geographic, as well as ethnic, gender, racial. And we would hope to be part of any discussions around jobs. The Oversight Committee, I think there was an oversight in not putting the Central Labor Council on that list. We represent a broader set of workers that do non-construction jobs. So these are the people that are relying on the transportation system every day to get to jobs or to get their kids to school. So I think we would also like to be added to that list. I agree with Mary's concerns about I believe lower income workers are probably underrepresented in all of the process, whether it's the EPAC or in the regional committees. There's just less ability for folks to participate in these kind of processes, right? So sometimes you have to make extra efforts to hear from them. And I'm thinking a little bit about the last mile when we're talking about because of sprawl, because of development, and because of service cuts to transit, I think we probably need to be looking at the last 2 or 3 or 4 miles. There's not BART stations everywhere. There's not transit hubs everywhere. Maybe I would love for us to build them, but we gotta be real. Even cab drivers, Uber drivers, they're not gonna want to be everywhere where people need them, right? Where people are living, where housing has been built, where the economic and dynamics going on in the Bay Area. You know, we know that the nature of some of our outlying areas are really changing, and people that are, you know, there's lots of folks, unless the state figures something out, how to put electric vehicles in, you know, for all low-income people, you know, that's not going to be a possibility, right? So I think, I don't know if the CCTA has studied, you know, these issues looking at income levels, but I think that needs to, you know, that could be part of what we do here with the money in this measure. The Oversight Committee should probably be called a review committee, to be honest with the voters, because there's no oversight function in how it's drafted in the TEP. It's solely review. It states specifically that no policy changes or allocations will be done by this Oversight Committee. So I'd like some clarity about who will be, when we're saying, you know, after we pass this measure, we'll look at the CDI program. Who's going to figure that out? And what's the plan for making sure that, you know, folks that need to be heard are heard in that process? I think we support the concepts of incentivizing using matching funds to move the harder pieces of the transformation of our transportation system into something that is truly 21st century and gets people away from being dependent on cars. It's not really on our agenda here, but I think that we do still really want to make sure that there is the ability for service increases for bus service. And I'm glad to see buses back in the TEP. That word wasn't in there, but, you know, people need to have 15-minute leeways, half-hour minimum and extended times to be able to rely on that. Also, I don't know if it's this or another question, but coordination between different transit agencies is really critical. Clipper card is great for that, but you know, if we pass this and end up in 30 years where people still have to pay 3 different transit agencies to get from Pittsburgh to Martinez, that's failure, right? That's failure. So I'll end my comments there that we, you know, let's talk more. The Labor Council represents transit or transportation users as well as workers, mechanics and so forth that provide services, and we certainly have a lot more to talk about, but there is promise in the direction that we've seen this moving. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. Peter?
Again, I agree with Cheryl. We've got a lot more to talk about, and I don't agree with the note that this is the best we can do, and we should therefore go forward with it. I think Contra Costa can do substantially better on the whole dimension of transformation in a countywide transportation plan than in this very rushed TEP. So I think it'd be better to drop the effort, which is doomed to not succeed. Either it won't pass or it won't be good for the county, and go back to deeper, longer range, central issue planning in the countywide transportation plan. We had among ourselves an evaluation document perhaps 6 weeks ago that indicated that the planning effort as it then was, I think it's been marginally improved since, was going to produce no improvement on vehicle miles traveled. That's the core of it. And again, I think we have to look at the core of the problem and not be bemused by making incremental improvements on many small aspects, which is what this discussion tends to run to. So I'd say let's go back to the mainline stuff, the longer history, and do a deeper, better job in the countywide transportation plan. I say that admitting the difficulties of it, and Bill's point about you have to satisfy not only the history books and history professors, but you have to satisfy 2/3 of the voters at the upcoming election. That's a very difficult criterion. So it's not that I'm saying it's easy.
Thanks, Peter. Kath?
Hey, thanks for an opportunity to give some comments. I think I want to start by commending Policy 7, that particularly the aspect of linking the work that's being done in Contra Costa County with the Sustainable Growth Council and the work that's being done statewide. And I'll note that the Sustainable Growth Council's Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program, which encourages smart growth around California and in particular infill development, recognize the importance of protecting agricultural lands around the urban edge and protecting it in particular for its value in reducing sprawl and greenhouse gas emissions by reducing vehicle miles traveled. That was recognized so much that this year that program allocated $40 million to agricultural conservation. And so here's another place where if we can put in some strong agricultural mitigation protections in our county, we also have an opportunity to produce some matching funds so that we are able to access that state funding. We need 25% local match to receive 75% state funding. So there's a great opportunity to leverage. And I think it also really highlights the importance of protecting agricultural land on the urban edge as a smart growth strategy. And so that leads me to number 11 that says requires jurisdictions that might be considering a non-voter approved amendment to their urban limit line to adopt agricultural protection ordinance or mitigate the loss of agricultural lands. I'm completely confused about the qualifier non-voter approved. That seems to me that this would only require an agricultural protection policy or mitigation if the addition was under 30 acres. Is that correct?
The way it's written, yes. The idea there is that if the voters are considering a change to the urban limit line, the voters ought to have basically the freedom to consider that proposal. So the idea here was to not, and this is just our thought process, is not to prejudge what the voters might or might not want to do. So that's the background of that. And I'm not surprised. Frankly, I've been expecting folks to suggest to take out a word or two and recommend. That's the kind of input we're trying to get to take back to the board.
Yes, I mean, it really marginalizes that requirement significantly to limit it to only 30-acre, changes in the urban limit line. I mean, what we've seen, in the last 10 years is significant pressure to push that urban limit line out into prime ag land, and it's hundreds of acres that we're on the edge of losing. And that is exactly the acreage on the urban edge that protects us from climate change. I'll also notice note, as I believe some of my colleagues have, the weakness of number 12 that simply requires additional disclosure rather than any kind of requirement for open space and agricultural protection. Although I'm a little confused, as always, about this process, I hope I have a chance also to comment briefly to the TEP itself, and I particularly wanted to comment to the advanced mitigation provisions. All of the conversations that we've been having in small breakout groups and all of the conversations that I've been involved with the Nature Conservancy and Liz Donahue have all included agricultural conservation as part of an advanced mitigation program. And I see that nowhere on page 23 is agriculture mentioned, so that's, I believe, really very different than the conversations that have been ongoing. And I will leave my comments at that.
Thank you very much, Councilman Ron.
Yeah, I have a number of comments I want to make in this section, and I want to start with the last item, which is number 14, and I find it interesting that it is the last item. And as Tom said earlier, it seems to me this should have been the first item, particularly with the absence of the CTP and the EIR. I would have hoped that we would have had an ever-present, mutually agreed-on vision of what we are attempting to do and accomplish in this community on behalf of not only the citizens and residents and businesses that are here today, but those that are going to be impacted by what we're doing here today for the next 30, 50, and 100 years. And without that as a vision statement and set of specific goals that we were attempting to develop this plan towards, we could go anywhere. So as I said the other night at the Authority, if you don't know where you want to go, any road will get you there. Without a vision and goal to mark and measure our direction, we can go anywhere. So I think, though, that everybody here in their own way is attempting to accomplish things that are for the benefit of the public. We just all look at it in very different kinds of ways. So that's the spirit in which I want to address a couple of these comments. And I'm not sure, I wrote down whether my comments were going to be as a cynic or a dreamer, and I'm not sure which one they are. I'd like to think that they are pragmatic. So on the CDI program, as Mike said, I think we had been in some conversation where the idea of using some methodology to try and help incentivize the ability for jurisdictions to encourage and cause more infill housing in the right areas and to create opportunities for more jobs and quality jobs near transit in the places where there are not jobs today but are a lot of housing. And we were hoping that we could do that through an incentive program, both in the CDI program as well as in by trying to incentivize a portion of the return to source money tied to housing production. Without those, and I want to call them teeth, we can call them incentives to make it nicer, but an incentive can be also the teeth that cause things to happen. Without that, it's likely not to happen. And we'll see more of the same that has got us into the dilemma and the congestion that we're in today, and that's what we want to try and avoid. So I pose it as a challenge to us to figure out how do we indeed incentivize these kinds of things in this measure in a way that cities will adopt them so that they will approve it and that we can all work diligently towards accomplishing more jobs and housing in those areas. Performance criteria, by the same token, I appreciate the evolution of a program on criteria to evaluate projects, but again, if it doesn't have teeth and/or incentives to suggest that if a project doesn't achieve a certain level of performance, we're not going to spend any of our valuable money on that project, or we're going to limit the amount of money we put onto that project. And so I think that we're on the right path with the performance criteria. I'd like to see how we can make that a more binding and directive program so that we are not necessarily funding projects that rank low on the criteria. Urban limit line. I appreciate the intent and the effort and the direction to try and create consistency from the county's plan to every city's plan. Approach to this makes absolute sense to do that. I do appreciate the removal of the item that had some kind of a limitation to the number of 30-acre adjustments that could take place. I think that was, for some reason, an idea that worked its way in here without our support and thought. But the other night at the authority, when it was suggested to be removed, some authority members said, well, I'm surprised that our environmental friends would allow that to happen. We thought they would enjoy that, or appreciate that. And we do appreciate that. The point is, we had another item to suggest that should be part of the 30-acre exception that has not been addressed in this at all. And that was, there are currently seven criteria for findings, one of which must be achieved in order to justify a 30-acre exception. We had put forward the idea of having an eighth finding added with the requirement that there be one of the seven original and the eighth finding. And that eighth finding would be that the purpose for the 30-acre exceptions must be for public benefit and not for housing or private housing or commercial purposes. And we had some language on that, and I don't have it specifically with me. But the original intent of the 30-acre exception was to provide a safety valve in case a community was faced with a dire situation for which the public needed some action to take place that would cause the urban limit line to be moved. And we think by adding this eighth finding as to go along with one of the other seven, it would make a profound reinforcement of that provision for dire situations. I agree with Catherine on number 11. The requirement for an agricultural protection ordinance should be linked to any change of an urban limit line. Agriculture is a historic community attribute and economic contributor to this community. And as urban limit lines get expanded, it isn't for the sake of ag, it is for the removal of ag, ranch lands and irrigated agriculture. And we need to mitigate for those. And so that should be part of any urban limit line change. We had, in number 12, there are a number of items that are here that are listed as additional disclosures. Once again, I think that these are all good planning practices that lend themselves to the quality of life of our communities. And I can suggest to you that when we have fought specifically in the Black Hawk community many, many years ago, when they wanted to build housing up onto the sides of Mount Diablo, and we ultimately were able to achieve a plan whereby those lands on the mountain slopes were dedicated to the state park as a condition of development, and all the housing was on the flatlands. Many years later, the owners and developers of that project came to us and said, we didn't like it at the time, but in retrospect, it added to the quality of the product that we were offering to the community. People appreciated it, and we made a lot more money. So these are the kind of things that people may may not recognize the benefits of today, but I think they should not be suggestions. These should be additional required elements on a checklist. And if, again, in the spirit of trying to keep it positive, let's incentivize it and give them a little more money if they have these kinds of things in some return to source equation calculation. I'm sorry I'm taking so long, but this was the place where we had the most comments. In the spirit of time, I think those are the major items. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ron. We wanted to open it up. I think there was one or two questions, at least general questions or comments. You're good.
Did your Bart comment?
For the sake of time, I'll submit my comments right.
Okay. Any other comments then? Well, we want to thank you very much. The next agenda item is really the path forward, and Ross talked a little bit about it, and I'm going to give him an opportunity to finish up. We really appreciate your sticking with us here.
Yeah, so one of the things I really do want to report to folks that weren't at the meeting the other night or didn't hear, there was a lot of suggestion about we're not ready to go, we need to take more time. Certainly our board is not there yet, so they're certainly on a path that we're working towards November 2016. Again, based on the direction they gave the bill, they want to get some input, and some of it's, is some things or are some things they don't want to hear, but they want to hear feedback from Bill and staff and our team on things that really we need to think about or do to be successful. So appreciate your comments. I think that a lot of that will be worked into our next memo to the board. So what that means is we're really down to about 4 weeks to wrap this up. As I mentioned, the version that will be approved on May 18th needs to stay consistent as we go through the city. So we really are down to about 4 weeks. A lot of work, but ultimately now it's really down to CCTA board decision on what the plan's going to look like and path forward to November. I heard a lot of questions. Folks want some clarity. Contact Bill or I anytime for that. We will be capturing the outcome of this meeting, and we need to circulate that quickly and get your response quickly, because we want to make sure that what we capture out of this meeting represents what you want us to say. So, Bill, that's something we got to talk about quickly, is how we get this out and ask you guys to review it so that what we're taking to our board represents your input here today. So we'll be asking for a quick turnaround on that. And then you can always continue to contact me, Bill, our board. A lot of you are in discussion with individual board members by phone, email, letter, and certainly encourage you to attend our board meetings. We're going to have 3 board meetings remaining to talk about this. Please attend and make comments for, against, make sure your opinion is heard. So with that, again, we're losing a lot of folks here. I do want to express sincere thanks and appreciation for your effort so far. I don't necessarily see us getting together as a group, but we do want to keep in contact with you individually so that we can continue this dialogue. So please continue to ping Bill or I, or we'll be reaching out. I know we have a meeting we're scheduling with, trying to schedule with Margaret and Cheryl. We'll get that going soon. So thank you all. Have a good Friday and a great weekend, and we'll be talking soon.